I'm Scott Kahn, and this is a special episode of the Orthodox Conundrum where we will learn more about the emerging ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas. I'm joined today by my friend Dr. Matthew Levitt, who is a guest on this podcast in episode 178, released on October 12th, 2023, just days after the tragedy of October 7th. Dr. Levitt is a former Wexner Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, where he directs the Institute's Reinhardt program on counterterrorism and intelligence. Previously, he served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Intelligence and Analysis at the U.S. Department of the Treasury, and before that as an FBI counterterrorism analyst, including work on the Millennial and September 11th plots. He also served as a State Department counterterrorism advisor to General James L. Jones, the Special Envoy for Middle East Regional Security. Dr. Levitt teaches at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service and the Center for Jewish Civilization, and has previously taught at Johns Hopkins University's Paul H. Nisi School of Advanced International Studies. He is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and sits on the advisory boards of several think tanks around the world. Widely published, Levitt's most recent book is Hezbollah, the Global Footprint of Lebanon's Party of God. He is also the author of several recent articles that are very important, which will be linked in the show notes. What Hamas wants in post-war Gaza, what Hamas wants in post-war Gaza, the power to what Hamas wants in post-war Gaza, the power to fight without the burden of governing, and the war Hamas always wanted. Matt, thank you for joining me today. I appreciate it.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. And as your listeners may remember from our last episode, I'll be well behaved because you and I go way back, and you've got dirt on me. I might even argue that I learned what I know about countering terrorism by you and I dealing with our younger brothers, who are now, of course, adults and successful in their own rights, but at the time were, well, younger brothers.
Yes, exactly. Okay. Very well stated. And let's jump right in because there's a lot to talk about and we don't have that much time. I want to ask you, Matt, what are the basic parameters of the deal that we heard about tonight that apparently is going to be signed in the next day or two?
So what's coming out is a 6-week deal in which 9 ill and wounded hostages from a list of 33 will be released in exchange for about 110 Palestinian people who have been sentenced to life sentences for their terrorist activity. Israel is also going to release about 1,000 Gazans who've been detained since October 8th, 2023, who were not involved in the October 7th attack. And elderly men over the age of 50 from the list of 33 hostages will be released in exchange of a 1-to-3 ratio for people who have life sentences and 1-to-27 ratio for people with other sentences. Ebram Mengistu and Hisham al-Sayed will be released according to exchange of 1 of 30, as well as 47 what they still call the Shalit prisoners. And a number of Palestinian prisoners will be released abroad or in Gaza based on lists agreed between both sides. That's the prisoner exchange. On the Philadelphia corridor, that stretch of land between the Gaza Strip and Egypt, which is so important to prevent arms smuggling back to Hamas, the Israeli side has agreed to gradually reduce forces in the corridor area during stage 1, the 6 weeks, based on accompanying maps that I've not yet seen. After the last hostage release during stage 1, that would be day 42, the Israeli forces will begin their withdrawal and complete it no later than day 50. On the Rafah border crossing, the crossing will be ready for the transfer of civilians and for the wounded after the release of all women, civilians, and soldiers. Israel will work towards the readiness of the crossing as soon as the agreement is signed, and they'll redeploy around the Rafah crossing, again, according to attached maps. There's parameters for the exit of wounded civilians from Gaza, for the return of unarmed, internally displaced persons. That deals with the ability to cross what's called the Nitzarim corridor that bisects the Gaza Strip, and for a protocol on unhumanitarian aid. All of this is contingent on this first stage 1, this 6-week period, which ultimately is the beginning of the long, long overdue process of obtaining the release of people who've been held hostage since October 7th, 2023.
Okay. How did they have the baby? Because all along, Hamas has insisted that the war end, and Prime Minister Netanyahu insisted that it will not end. What did they decide in the end about that particular issue?
Well, as you can imagine, that kind of making of the sausage is not going to be in this draft they've written in paper. For Hamas, they want the war to end, and they want there to be space in which they can continue to function as part of the society and part of, not the, but part of the governing structure that follows in the Gaza Strip. For Israel, for Prime Minister Netanyahu in particular, this obviously falls short of quote unquote total victory. I've been saying for a long time that total victory is not a policy, it's a mantra. But at the end of the day, the overwhelming majority of Israelis, and I think people around the world, want to secure the release of hostages, especially those who are still alive. And for them, after being held in horrible, horrible conditions for so long, every day matters. And so I think that this agreement is to be lauded. We need to get people who are alive out now. And then I think all sides to this will figure out how they will respond. Israel is clearly not going to forgive and forget. Hamas did what it did. It was very proud about it. It said it would do it over and over again. The Israelis are going to act accordingly in a manner to protect Israeli lives. And Palestinians are going to insist that there be something positive that comes next. And if Hamas can't deliver that, there's not going to be blind obedience to Hamas. That said, Hamas remains powerful in the Gaza Strip. I think that when Secretary Blinken yesterday in a public speech said that U.S. intelligence assesses that Hamas has recruited about as many people as they've lost, call me highly, highly skeptical. Even if the numbers are accurate, we're talking about hiring kids for pennies who have no skills, no training. They're not the quality they've lost real fighters. And sure, people are desperate. They've got people to say, sure, for a few pennies a day, I'll call me Hamas. That said, Hamas still has capabilities. And so it's going to be very important moving forward, I think, beyond the specifics of this deal to do two things. And this first applies to Hamas, it applies to Hezbollah, it applies to the Houthis. We should all understand by now, taking a big step backwards, the tremendous cost, not just to Israel, but to the whole region, to the West, all of us, of allowing Iran to fund and arm proxies without any real hindrance for years and years and years. I think part of the problem leading up to October 7th, and Israelis have admitted this to me, is, leading up to October 7th, they were looking for game-changing strategic weapons entering the Gaza Strip, rockets. But no one was watching for AK-47s. Well, what are they going to do with a bunch of AK-47s? What are they going to storm the border? Well, yeah. And so now, like any weapons, all of this, for Hezbollah, for Hamas, for the Houthis, all of these groups are only as capable as they are because of Iranian weapon systems and Iranian money. The second, specific to Hamas, is it is absolutely critical that Hamas not be allowed to play any role in the governance structure that follows in Gaza. Even the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank is saying that now, I think in part because of the incoming Trump administration. And they also cannot be allowed to be kind of a second fiddle to whatever power structure comes, but be allowed to maintain arms and be a militant group. This has to end. And at the end of the day, I think we are where we are today, finally, so long overdue, because not only has Hamas been beaten so bad and their leaders taken out, etc., but they've lost their critical ally in Hezbollah. Their overarching sponsor in Iran is also on its back heels. And they have an incoming president in the United States that has made it very clear that if there was not a deal before he came into the White House, there would be, quote, hell to pay. I think it's important to note that applied, he said it less explicitly, but implicitly, not only for the Palestinians, but for the Israelis as well, which gave Prime Minister Netanyahu pretty significant leverage over the Smotriches and the Ben-Gvirs of his coalition who really didn't want this deal for fear that it would preclude total victory. But at the end of the day, everybody understood this was to be achieved now. The incoming president-elect made that clear.
Okay, there's a lot of information there. Let me ask a question first. What does it mean for Hamas not to have any part of the governing structure in any real way if they still are so powerful? How would they ever agree to such a deal?
Thanks for having me. Look, this is the crux of it. Who is going to go in now and provide services? Who is going to go in and run ministries and offices? And who is going to go in, if anybody? And I don't think should have expectations that some Arab force is going to go in and attack Hamas. But who's going to go in there and prevent Hamas from coming out and, controlling space, controlling businesses, trying to infiltrate into things? Um, that is not an answerable question in the moment. We're not there yet. That's not what this deal does. The White House has explained that the idea is over these next 6 weeks to start having very serious conversations about this. But this is going to be very, very difficult, not only in a practical way, but also politically. I mean, the Ben Gvirs and the Smotriches are going to say, fine, we get the hostages out, but like that we can't, that's a bridge too far. On the flip side, you're going to have a tremendous desire to get humanitarian aid in. You're going to have the Arab world wanting this to succeed. You can have the West wanting this war to end. And there's going to be both pressure on Hamas and pressure on Israel to negotiate and to give in on certain things, to compromise, so that the ceasefire is maintained. I don't know what that's going to look like just yet.
Matt, you mentioned before that Trump's pressure, perhaps less explicitly, but still there on Israel. And reports came out this week that there was pressure by his envoy on Bibi Netanyahu, gave Netanyahu the excuse, so to speak, to sideline Smotrich and Ben Gvir. How much do you think Netanyahu himself wanted this deal, and how much is he actually giving into Trump's pressure without himself being interested in it?
I'm not a psychologist. I can't get into his head. But I think that it is clear that while I think total victory is a slogan, it's something that he was committed to. And I think when he hears the nominee for Secretary of Defense saying that he thinks the Israelis should be allowed to kill every single last Hamas guy, that resonates with him. Whether that is feasible, realistic is a second thing. So I think what Prime Minister Netanyahu's calculation is you don't want to start off with the Trump administration on a bad foot. He has both had a good relationship with Trump, and he's gone through periods of time where he had a difficult relationship with Trump. He does not want the latter. And I think he also feels that if he does this for President Trump, if he delivers, that on the back end, I think there's an anticipation that the Trump administration is going to give him the leeway to do things that need to get done. I'm not sure that's entirely true if that kind of leeway is going to undermine the ceasefire. That remains to be seen. But I think it's not simply the case that this enabled him to push back on Ben Gvir and Smotrich to do the things that he really wanted to do. I think that he has real misgivings about doing anything that allows Hamas to resurface. I don't think, obviously, he's not against getting hostages back, of course, but that tension between those who are primarily focused on getting the hostages back and those, and I put the prime minister in this camp, who are primarily focused on keeping Hamas down, that obvious tension, because of the incoming Trump administration, because of Hamas being in the position it's in, we find ourselves in an opportunity to have this deal. I have to say, by the way, that for all of the reports that Prime Minister Netanyahu complicated negotiations and added things or whatever, what I've heard from negotiators on the U.S. side is that the reason there has not been a deal so far is because Hamas has done that. Hamas has moved the goalposts. Hamas has moved goalposts on how many people had to be released and which types of people had to be released and who would be released under the first period of the deal, first phase, etc. U.S. authorities are convinced that, say what you will about the Prime Minister Netanyahu, that the reason there hasn't been a deal so far was because of Hamas.
Yeah, in fact, I believe Secretary of State Blinken said that a day or two ago in an interview when people asked
Not the
him,
first time.
and he
He
said,
said it
okay,
multiple times.
okay. Now, this is sort of a strange question to ask because I don't know how you define victory, but perhaps that's my real question. Hamas inevitably will declare victory. I remember being in college during the first Gulf War and a politics professor, having a headline from Baghdad that wrote Iraq wins. It was quite funny. After the first Gulf War with first Bush there, Hamas is going to say they won. How do you define victory over here? Because frankly, some people on the far right in Israel will agree with Hamas. They'll say this is a defeat for Israel.
Each party will define victory differently. The Islamist militant groups in the region have traditionally defined victory as not being destroyed. So Hezbollah declares divine victory in 2006 by virtue of being the first Arab army not to be decimated by Israel. So I think Hamas, one reason they really want this deal right now is because under a ceasefire, they will be able to go out into the streets. We're seeing it already this evening in local time, going out into the streets with Hamas headbands and their weapons and saying, we're here, we've never been defeated, we've been deployed, we're going to be deployed, to show the world, to show the public that they are still there. And that for them will be victory. For everything that's happened, Israel has not been able to destroy us. The fact is that Hamas is effectively destroyed as a fighting force. Their military-industrial complex is destroyed. Their tunnel system has been mapped and largely rendered useless. Their lathes and their machines to build weapons domestically have been destroyed. Their ability to make money off of smuggled goods and off of money coming into the Gaza Strip has been severely curtailed. All they have left is making money off of humanitarian goods that have come in, which is not insignificant, but nothing like what they had before. I think for Israel, the realistic goal is twofold. One, significantly degrading Hamas as a fighting force, which by any measure has been a wild success. Again, even if one were to take this purported U.S. assessment at face value that Hamas has recruited as many people about as they've lost, these are not people of the same caliber at all, and they're fighting with whatever small arm or sticks they have left. They don't have the arsenal they once did. And the second is that what comes next in Gaza should not be run by militants, and that there has to be better border security structures in place such that you don't have a militant group sworn to your destruction, armed to the teeth, so close to the civilian communities in the Gaza envelope, and so close by range of missile to the center of the country from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. I think those are achievable. What Israel was never going to be able to achieve was to take some type of scalpel and cut Hamas out of the body politic. That is something that gets done not militarily, but through other means. Now, first, to do that, you had to significantly degrade their military capabilities. And you can check that box. It's not something that you check and then move on. This is going to continue. And it's quite clear that the Israelis had a sense that this was going to happen because the IDF has been hitting Hamas hard in Gaza just over the past few days. To get in last licks to target things that they really wanted to target for some time. Now the hard work comes of Israel being in a position of having to say what comes next. My concern, not from a political perspective or even a policy perspective, but as a counterterrorism person, has been that if you think that Hamas is the worst it can get there, you get another thing coming. And if you don't have some type of governance structure to come in behind everything that's happened and behind the destruction, behind the Hamas governance, you could have something much, much worse. Maybe not tomorrow, the next day or next year, but the seeds will be planted for something much worse. You do not want a vacuum in Gaza. And so now's the opportunity. There are all kinds of political issues, policy issues, issues in terms of the coalition government in Israel as to what this government wants to agree to and could agree to, but there's got to be something, and it's clear from the U.S. perspective, and I think that the incoming Trump administration will agree to this, that the expectation is that those conversations are going to have in a real, more tangible way be had over the next 6 weeks.
As unfortunate as that thought is, could you define much worse meaning? I'll explain what I mean. We used to think that Hezbollah was much worse than Hamas. Now, they were much stronger than Hamas, but in terms of their ideology, we thought Hamas really is interested in governing, and they talk big, or at least this is the conventional wisdom before October 7th. They don't really want to fight with Israel. In fact, in some of the dust-ups that had happened previously, such as 2021, Islamic Jihad was involved and Hamas stood on the sidelines. So much worse wasn't actually true. We thought that Hamas was much better than Hezbollah, or at least somewhat better. It turned out they're quote unquote the same, and their goals may be even worse than Hezbollah. What would be worse than Hamas? And I don't refer to strength, but in terms of ideology.
Right. So the issue in terms of the Hamas-Hezbollah comparison was always in terms of strength and capability. And Hezbollah is many times larger than Hamas was at its largest. Even now, with Hezbollah, cut off at the knees, significantly degraded, lost so many leaders and operatives, et cetera, they're still a dangerously capable organization. Not like they were, but still very dangerously capable. What I mean worse is you could have Al-Qaeda, ISIS type groups thrive in a situation of desperation where there's so much destruction, there's no reconstruction, people are day in, day out struggling to find food. You don't want Somalia on the Mediterranean. And so, and again, that wouldn't be tomorrow or next month or next year, but the potential cost of allowing the Gaza Strip to just fester as an open wound is not, I don't believe, in Israel's interest, separate from the fact that morally and ethically we should be trying to fix the situation that is there. I think we talked about this last time, but weeks before October 7th, our think tank, I wasn't involved in it, but the Washington Institute took a poll on the Gaza Strip, and over 70% of Gazans wanted Hamas out, wanted Hamas disarmed, did not support Hamas targeting Israel, right? It's simply not the case that, all Gazans are Hamas. Now, Gazans of all colors and shapes and sizes have been kind of radicalized by the painful existence they've lived through. But I think we have to do something about Gaza for their interests and for Israel's interests. And that's going to be difficult, especially in terms of getting a political agreement.
Let me ask you, do you believe that Hamas has been more or less deterred from trying something like October 7th again? Obviously, now they don't have the capability, but many people, especially on the far right, are saying once this deal goes into place, Hamas the next day will start trying to rearm and start trying to build new tunnels and finding new ways to do a new October 7th. Do you think that's realistic, or have they been reasonably deterred despite what they might say publicly?
We're going to split that up into two pieces. One is, have they been deterred? The second is, will they be capable of digging new tunnels and preparing? The first, I would say no, that Hamas always was misdiagnosed as being something else and still is a very hardline Islamist organization dedicated to Israel's destruction. The fact that Hamas leaders came out right after October 7th and multiple times since saying, look, the blood of Palestinians had to spill in order to get public opinion, it shows how radical they are. Not only how cavalier they are about Israeli lives, how cavalier they are about Palestinian lives. So for those who thought that October 7th was Hamas putting the Palestinian cause back on the international agenda, I remind that actually what they were doing was upending the first potential progress on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in a long time, because there was the prospect of Israeli-Saudi normalization, and the Saudis were demanding real, tangible dividends for the Palestinians. And even Prime Minister Netanyahu was seriously considering that for the big prize of normalization with Saudi. That's what they were trying to derail, not what they were trying to get on the agenda. So will they try? 100%. Will they be committed to doing that? Yes. Are they deterred? No. But will they be able? That's up to us. Frankly, it was a colossal series of misdiagnoses and failed policies that put Hamas in a position to be anywhere near where it was on October 7th. And I don't think that we should anticipate that the way we're going to solve this is by changing Hamas's mind. Instead, what we have to do is two things. We have to make it so that they can't rearm. They can't refund. They are not enjoying safe haven and freedom of movement to be able to start digging kilometers and kilometers and kilometers of tunnels and infrastructure, et cetera. And that should be a doable thing, and that has to be a sine qua non of whatever comes next. And we have to provide something, an alternative to what was and what is, because that's how you compete. I think the overwhelming majority of people, again, certainly before October 7th in the Gaza Strip, were not big fans of Hamas. If you show them that someone else can come in and without spending their entire existence hating on the guy next door, focus on building the economy, on building self-rule, on providing opportunities to work and to go to school and to put 3 meals on the table without having to worry about that. Like, that's what people ultimately want, unless you force them into a situation where they don't have the luxury of thinking about that because they just see what's happening. So you can compete with Hamas ideologically by providing an alternative. And you have to use your bullets for those hardline true believers who certainly will seek to destroy Israel sometime. Only now we're not October 6th anymore, where tomorrow they could do something terrible. We're in a situation where, yeah, it's true. There's not total victory. It's not the case that Hamas has been decimated from the world. I wish Israeli leaders hadn't used that terminology. It was never going to be the case, right? But they are nowhere near as capable as they were. And whatever the deal does and says, ultimately, over time, Israel, hopefully with its allies, including Arab and even Palestinian allies, but certainly on its own, is going to do what it has to do to continue to degrade Hamas militarily in terms of its militant and terrorist capabilities. So everyone should take a deep breath when they see Hamas parading in the streets with their green headbands and whatever few guns they have left, where they say, look, we're still here. You've done nothing to us. Call me skeptical, all right? At the end of the day, what the Israeli military has achieved here has been very, very significant at very, very high cost to Israel and certainly to the Palestinians. I blame Hamas for this. This was Hamas's plan. This was the war Hamas always wanted. It planned for there to be as much devastation and blood and cost to Palestinians as there was. And that was okay with them so long as they could kill Israelis. And I don't think Palestinians are going to soon forget that.
We're almost out of time, Matt, but I have two quick questions I want to ask you. They may not be quick, but I'll ask them quickly. The first one is the Saudi Arabian track, the idea of peace with Saudi Arabia or some arrangement with Saudi Arabia beyond which Israel has now, and the future of a Palestinian state. Do you think that's more or less likely now than it was before? I mean, before October 7th. And second of all, I'm wondering, for those people who say Israel should not have made this deal, I have been saying to my own family, I was afraid of a Vietnam-like quagmire. And obviously every case is different, but I've read enough about Vietnam. That's my go-to example. So my questions are, do you think a Palestinian state is in the offing along with a peace deal with the Saudis? And if there were no deal, do you think this could have turned into a quagmire?
So look, I certainly think the Trump administration is going to want to get itself into a position where it can be back to building out the Abraham Accords. This was a signature achievement. And I think that is something that we all should anticipate will be on the agenda. Even before October 7th, the normalization deal was not for a Palestinian state tomorrow. It was for tangible and irreversible progress towards a Palestinian state. And I think you're probably going to have very similar language still, but I think that people understand, even if they won't talk about it publicly, they understand privately that the reality is that certainly Gaza is not ready for a Palestinian state tomorrow. And the Israelis are so scarred from the hell that they've been living through, with a trend in which, withdrawing from territory and entrusting a Palestinian partner has led to intifadas and attacks from Lebanon and attacks from Gaza. And there's going to have to be a period of building trust. There's going to have to be a period of building infrastructure. Like, there's a lot that has to be done in Gaza immediately before we get to the big ideas of a state. What state? And who's going to lead it? Right? I mean, Abu Mazen, the head of Fatah and effectively the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, for a very long time now has barely governed Ramallah. let alone the West Bank. And he's now trying to do more and demonstrate his relevance to counter militants in the West Bank, again, primarily because the Trump administration is coming in. That's good, but it's not like there's an authority to which you can just hand things over and say, hey, thank you so much. And that's why one key component that I think people are going to be looking at and trying to put together over the next 6 weeks is, what can various Arab states do? What can the international community do economically? And then what are the fail-safes for border control, for funds that come in for reconstruction that in the past Hamas has very effectively diverted for things like tunnel construction and weapons procurement. We've learned our lesson. We've seen them. We've read the book. We don't want to see the movie. So we know what our job is now. And just because Hamas is going to be just as interested in seeing Israel's destruction doesn't mean that now, January 15th, 2025, they're anywhere near capable of doing it. Took them about 17 years to prepare last time. Our job is to make sure they don't have the opportunity to do that over the next 17.
Okay, well, I really appreciate your time, Dr. Matthew Levitt. This has been very informative, and let's hope that things move in a positive way for all of the people of Israel and the world. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me. Here's to getting as many hostages home alive to their families as possible.